Welcome to the new episode, which is the resolution of the last episode's cliffhanger. In this instance, we're going to consider a replacement example. So to begin with, let me read this one to you. It seems shorter, there's fewer words, but it's far more complicated to actually do. So bear with me as we get through this. The company is considering, and it doesn't matter which company it is, the company, whatever company it is considering the purchase of a new packaging machine. The old one is currently being depreciated at $10,000 per year straight line and is scheduled to end in 5 years with no remaining book value. If you don't replace it, you'll be lucky to get it removed for the amount you could salvage it for, so you don't expect any profit, so to speak, in 5 years. If you replace it now, you believe you can salvage it for $40,000 net of tearing it out and having it removed, and buy a new machine for $160,000 plus $12,500 shipping fee and another $10,500 for installation. The machine will reduce the operating cost of the company by $75,000 per year. The new machine will be depreciated using the 3-year MACRS, Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System, for simplicity purposes. Don't believe that last part, by the way. The MACRS actually makes this a little more complicated. The useful life of this machine is 5 years and is expected to yield $1,000 in net salvage value at the end of the 5 years. Again, you may assume a tax rate of 34%, and again, we're going to assume the weighted average cost of capital is 15%. Based on all of that, how do I turn this into a capital budgeting problem like we did the last one? As it turns out, this one's not as well organized as far as, okay, here's the initial cash flows, and here are all of the operating cash flows, and here are all of the terminal cash flows. Well, the terminal cash flows are all in one place, but everything else is kind of mixed up. You may not look like it, but they are. So let me break them into the 3 pieces just to make sure we're not missing things as we work our way through this. So to begin with, I'm going to be looking at the initial cash flow. Initial investment outlays, or initial cash flow, are the incremental cash flows at the beginning of a project's life. So anything that happens at the beginning, that's what we're going to be looking at. In particular, and this is very important in this instance, in the replacement decision, we take into account the cash flows associated with disposal of the old equipment. Net of taxes. The one that's given is not net of taxes, it's net of pulling it out. So we're going to have to do the taxes separately. And then, of course, we still have to include any net change in working capital. This problem doesn't give us any of those, so that's not going to be an issue. The real issue is going to be that second one, the replacement decision, and getting the old equipment net of taxes. So what are the initial cash flows in this instance? Well, we'll have to get things started, and therefore we're going to have to look at the cost of buying the new machine, plus the shipping fee, plus the installation costs. So that we'll have to look up front. Second, we're going to be looking at the salvage value. So salvaging the old equipment for $40,000. And that's going to be net of taxes. Now, the tax issue is dependent on what the current book value is. And there's nothing here that says what the current book value is, but it can be implied. Notice up toward the top it says the old equipment is currently being depreciated at $10,000 per year straight line and is scheduled to end in 5 years with no remaining book value, which implies that the book value currently, right now, is $50,000. It is critical to understand that we have $50,000 that this is worth on the books. I think I can get $40,000 out of it if I had to salvage it right now. That means there's $10,000 in depreciation that I haven't yet recognized, and I will get a little bit of a tax shield out of that additional depreciation. So let's look at the initial cash flow, and to do that I'm going to turn our attention to Excel. Okay, and we are back in Excel, and we have a new sheet which we've renamed Replacement Decision, and I'm going to start right up at the top as I did the last one with the heading Initial cash flow. I'm going to pop down here and then say, how much does the equipment cost? How much is the shipping? How much is the installation? And therefore, what is the depreciable base? And I'm going to highlight all of that, draw a line right here, and then start filling it in. Now before I start filling it in, I think what I'm going to do is highlight at least this chunk that I think I'm going to use here, and do a comma with 0 decimal points, and they just hit comma and hit my decreased decimal a couple of times, and then I'm going to hit equipment of 160,000, my shipping of 12,500, my installation of 10,500, and then the depreciable base will be the sum of all of that. So I'm going to just pop up to auto sum and click it, and it should highlight all the pieces that I really want, and then I'm going to hit enter. 183,000 even. I'm going to skip a couple of lines and then say, okay, so what is the salvage of old equipment? Then we'll be looking at the book value of old equipment. I'm going to widen this out because I know I'm going to need it to be a lot wider all over as I get down there anyway. So I'm going to say salvage was 40,000 according to the story problem. The book value, and just so I can remember where I got this from, I'm going to say 5 times 10,000. And I'm going to draw another line. This time I'm not adding, I'm looking at additional depreciation, which is just going to be that one, the 50,000 book value, minus its salvage value, 10,000 bucks. So I'm going to end up getting $10,000 more in depreciation. I'm going to skip a couple more lines. I'm going to be looking at the incremental tax shield. And since this is really tied to the discussion up here, I think I'm going to move it up there. Yeah, maybe not quite there. I'll put it there. I'm going to say equals 10,000 times 0.34, my tax rate. And so now I'm going to say initial cash flow. And at this point I can see all of my cash flows. Not all of them are obvious as cash flows. Some of them are just, the 50,000 has nothing to do with anything. The 10,000 has nothing to do with cash. So neither of those have anything to do with cash, but everything else does. The problem is I don't have all the signs right. So which ones are outflows and which ones are inflows? Well, let's see. The 183,000 is an outflow, so I'm going to make that negative 183. Then I'm going to add to that the 40,000, which comes in because I'm selling the old equipment and picking up 40,000 after I pay for pulling it out and all of that other jazz. And then I get a tax shield of 3,400 based on that additional depreciation that I'm going to realize immediately. And so I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to get negative 139,600 as my initial cash flow, which brings us down a couple more lines, and I'm going to say operating cash flow. This one's going to get really complicated really fast, or at least it's going to seem that way, because we're not going to be dealing, as we did in the last one, with total revenue, total expenses, and total everything else. We're going to be looking at incremental. So I'm going to scroll this up, and then we're going to go look at the problem again. So here's our problem, and it doesn't seem to have an awful lot there, but it has everything that we need to come up with the operating cash flows. They're just going to be a little bit of a mess. So let me again reiterate what the operating cash flow should contain. So bear with me as we hit that. Operating cash flow represents the incremental operating cash flow as a result of the adoption of the project. And again, in our new project, everything, totally everything was incremental. In this instance, it's not. We're just looking at the difference. What difference would there be in adopting versus not adopting? And in particular, we're going to be looking at cash revenues, change in cash revenues, change in cash expenditures, change in taxes, and then we're going to be doing the same thing that we did before. We're going to be taking the incremental operating earnings or the incremental taxable earnings, multiplying them by the tax rate to come up with the incremental tax, getting an incremental net earnings, and then adding back the incremental depreciation to get the new cash flows, the incremental cash flows, the incremental operating cash flows. And so this is going to be a little more complicated, so bear with me as we go through this. Which of these actually help us figure out what the incremental operating earnings are going to be? Well, the $75,000 does, because it says the machine will reduce the operating costs of the company by $75,000 per year. That means that the operating earnings will shift by $75,000, but that doesn't include any of the depreciation. So we have to look at the new depreciation, which is Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System, the MACRS system, and it's a 3-year asset that we're going to be depreciating. But we're not just looking at the new one, we're looking at the incremental depreciation. So the new one is going to be depreciated using MACRS. The old one is currently being depreciated using straight lines. So we're going to be looking at the difference between those two. And just so you can understand the MACRS, let me add to the good information what the MACRS actually looks like. MACRS again stands for Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System, and these are the percentages. Having said that, let's pop over to Excel and start building our spreadsheet. I'm actually going to start by trying to figure out what the MACRS should be. So I'm going to do a T1 for time 1. These are all different numbers and different time periods. Highlight the 1, subscript, and hit enter, and hit enter again. Now I'm going to center that one and move it across to T5. By the way, if it's not allowing you to subscript, it's because you already did a comma and 0 decimal points and it's having issues, I think. At least that's what it did with me in an earlier attempt at doing this. So let's do the MACRS percentages. And the MACRS percentages in this instance are 33.33% for the first year. By the way, that means that about a third of the value gets depreciated in the very first year, which seems like it's about right because it's a 3-year program. The thing is, this is accelerated, and you're going, how is that accelerated? And the answer is we're going to be looking at a double declining balance to begin with, and that kind of straight lines out toward the end. That's what the MACRS actually ends up doing. And what we're going to be looking at is the percentages straight from the 3-year class of investments off of the book, which is where I got my outline from for the percentages that I'm using here. And these numbers are actually, the first time I looked at them, I'm going, this is so weird. Why are there 4 of them if it's 3-year project? And the answer is that they assume that you bought the new equipment halfway through year 1. So you have half of year 1, all of year 2, all of year 3, and half of year 4. That's your 3 years. But they straddle 4 different years that we're taking into account. And so it's doing a modified double declining balance kind of a thing where you're getting as much as you can up front and then kind of trailing it off toward the end, but then it's splitting it weirdly. I'm hoping that made some conceptual sense. So at this point we're going to be looking at the incremental operating earnings I think I'm going to say operating earnings just to save myself a little more room here. And these were $75,000 per year. And the point of this, by the way, is that it goes up $75,000 per year because the costs would be reduced by $75,000 per year. I'm going to move down a little bit and then say depreciation of the new equipment. What would that look like? Again, we're going to be looking also at the depreciation of the old equipment because we need this to be incremental, and incremental is the change. And we are foregoing depreciating the old equipment. So we're going to be looking at the new equipment and saying equals the percent times the depreciable base. And because we want to hold this depreciable base constant as we copy across this way, and if we don't hit F4, it will just go and hit blank cells, which isn't helpful. I'm going to hit F4 so that it says C19 in my case times $C $5. I'm going to hit enter and scroll back. See, it's easier for me to handle this in video format. So I'm going to scroll that, or now I'm going to pull that one across. You have to widen those out. That last one I wish it were wider, but it's going to get there in a minute. And these, I don't need the extra decimal points. And on this last one, in fact, from here on out, I can probably just do my same story here. Just comma with 0 decimal points. Wow, I should have just done comma 0. I didn't realize that was there. And then do 10,000. And highlight and pull across. Widen that back out. And point out at the bottom that now that I have just my depreciation of old equipment highlighted, that it sums to 50,000, which is the exact amount that we had for book value, which is always nice. So I'm going to move down here first off and say incremental depreciation. And I'm going to highlight my 10,000s and put a line underneath them so that we understand that that's what we're summing here. Actually, not summing, we're looking at the difference. We're going to say equal the new equipment minus the old equipment depreciation. So I'm going to get $50,994 more in depreciation that first year, and so on as I move my way across. That's going to generate a new incremental, well, it would help if I would spell it right, taxable earnings, which are going to be the 75,000 minus the depreciation, the difference in depreciation. I'm going to highlight those and pull those across. Oh, every time I do that, I get a different number. Well, you know what? For some reason, I'm not getting 0 decimal points. There, now I am. So I'm now going to highlight, or no, move down a line and say, what are the incremental taxes? Because everything else up to this point has been incremental. These tax rates, or this tax amount, is going to be incremental. So I'm going to take my incremental taxable earnings and multiply it by the 34% that is our tax rate. I'm going to get the incremental taxes. I'm going to pull that one across. I'm going to move down a couple more and say, so what are the incremental net earnings? Equals incremental taxable earnings minus taxes. I'm going to pull that one across. I'm going to move down a couple more and do, therefore, the operating cash flow, and this is all incremental, remember, is just going to be the incremental net earnings plus the incremental depreciation. And therefore, as I pull that across, you'll notice that in only one instance is the incremental net earnings bigger than the operating cash flow, and that's because we're foregoing $10,000 of depreciation to add to it up there. That's what the big difference is. So there are my incremental operating cash flows, which leaves us, again, let me scroll up, with the terminal cash flows. So the terminal cash flow is the only one that appears at this point. I'm going to go up and we're going to read one last time, but the one that looks like it's the only terminal cash flow is the useful life of this machine is 5 years and is expected to yield $1,000 in net salvage value at the end of the 5 years. Now that's net again of pulling it out and selling it off. So first off, let's make sure that this is the only one there really is by reviewing what we had listed down for terminal cash flow. Terminal cash flows. Terminal cash flows are those cash flows associated with winding the project down. So the project in this instance is the buying of the new equipment. So we wind that down when we sell off the new equipment as being old. Terminal cash flow should include final disposal of the project. The cash flow associated with disposal should be net of cash received for salvage, costs associated with removal, tax effects due to recapture of depreciation expense or impairment of, which is additional depreciation, and then returning the firm's operations to normal, including returning working capital to normal levels. Well, we're not going to do that. Evidently, we're just going to continue to replace the old machinery. So we're really looking at the stuff in the middle. The cash flows associated with disposal should be net of all of this stuff. So let's pop down to the story problem and make sure there's nothing else in here. And I don't think there are, but we'll double check. And in fact, as we look through here one more time, we see the useful life of the machine is 5 years and is expected to yield $1,000 in net salvage value at the end of the 5 years. Now, by the way, I do have to point out that there is one other reason why that's the only relevant one. The other reason is if you look at the old machine, it's currently being depreciated at $10,000 per year and is scheduled to end in 5 years with no remaining book value. If you don't replace it, you'll be lucky to get it removed for the amount you could salvage it for, so you don't expect any profit in 5 years. In other words, the book value and the market value would both be zero at that point, and therefore there's no tax effect if we let it go all the way to the end. The new machine, however, is going to have $1,000 left, and therefore there might be a tax effect depending upon what the book value is. Oh crud, what is the book value? This one I can't as easily see from just the story problem unless you know a little bit more about the Mackers system. And so let me pop back over to Excel, and I'll show you that we do know what the book value is at the end of 5 years, and we'll know how to handle the $1,000 in net salvage value. So here we go. First off, let's find out what the book value. Actually, I guess we can actually type in salvage of new equipment is $1,000. What's the book value of new equipment? Well, at the end of this time period, we will have depreciated all of this out of it, which, as we highlight the depreciation of the new equipment and we look down at the bottom, we see that it sums to $183,000, which is magically the cost. The depreciable base is $183,000, and we've depreciated at $183,000. So the book value at this point is, well, 0. I'm going to underline this and say, okay, here is what is called recapture of depreciation, which is just going to be my salvage of new equipment minus the book value. So what is going to be the incremental tax on that $1,000? It's going to be equal to the $1,000 times 0.34. Now, it's important also here to note, maybe you'd note it mentally, maybe you note it by writing this stuff down on the spreadsheet, that the old equipment is relevant. The problem is it does not have, I mean, if we did the same thing for the old equipment, we'd be doing this, salvage of old equipment. I'm expecting to get 0 out of it. What's the book value of old equipment? Well, it's also 0. So if we did a recapture of, or impairment of, or whatever you wanted to call it, so I'm going to say recapture / impairment. And we're going to say this one is going to be equal to salvage minus the book value, which is going to be 0. Therefore, the incremental tax, and I keep misspelling stuff and it's driving me nuts. Is going to also be equal to that number, which is 0, times 0.34, which is 0. So at this point, if I'm looking at the terminal cash flow, I'm going to be looking at the amount that I'm getting in cash, the 1,000, minus incremental tax. And then I'm going to be subtracting out of that any salvage from the old equipment minus any tax effect there as well. Now that second half is just going to be 0. 0 minus 0, so it's not going to be anything. It's going to be 660 total. At this point, we need to do our little table thing at the bottom. I can actually save myself some time by copying the headings and moving them down to, say, here, and then highlighting those and moving them back, and I get my T0. Then I'm going to be saying initial cash flow, operating cash flow, terminal cash flow. I'm going to scroll this up so it's not as awkward. And with the initial cash flow, we're going to be looking at the line that says initial cash flow. We've done everything correctly. This should work as is. So for the operating cash flow, we're going to say equal. I'm going to scroll up here and grab the first one. It's in T1 again. I'm going to pull those across, and I should be getting all of those numbers, which I am. The terminal cash flow is in year 5 in this instance, N in general, so I'm going to just grab it and pop it in there at the last. I'm going to highlight the total, the numbers under terminal cash flow, pop up, draw the line, go below the first one, the T0, zoom up to auto sum, click, and it's highlighting everything in that column below T0. So I'm going to hit enter. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. And as we pull it across, I pulled it a little too far, we get the 46,760. Notice that these look like they're just this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. But this one is actually, in the last year, we actually have to take into account the terminal cash flow as well. So I'm going to skip a line and then do my weighted average cost of capital, just as I did in the earlier example, at 15%. And then I'm going to do net present value, IRR, and MIRR. The net present value is going to be equal to NPV. I need to tell it the rate, comma, just T1 through Tn, close parenthesis, plus the initial outlay. Then my IRR is going to be equal to IRR, highlight the whole thing and just hit enter. I'm going to give myself on these probably a couple of extra decimal points. Wow. Let me try this again, because these two should be percents with 2 decimal points. There we go. That one I kind of wanted 2 decimal points on it anyway. So MIRR is equal to MIRR. Highlight all of the cash flows again, put a comma, and we're going to finance at the weighted average cost of capital, and we hope to reinvest at least that amount. So therefore we get the 2388. So we have those, and since my net present value is greater than 0, it says accept the project, and since IRR and MIRR are both greater than 15%, that also says accept the project. So in our replacement example, again summarizing what we just did, NPV 62,902.97, IRR 34.38%, MIRR 23.88%. Because NPV is greater than 0, we're going to adopt the project. Because the IRR and MIRR are greater than the weighted average cost of capital, which is 15% in this instance, we're going to adopt the project. Hoping that made some sense. In the next video, we're going to take into account what do we do in these instances if we have inflation. We're going to relax that assumption and say what happens when we have inflation. See you in the next video, and hopefully that was enough of a cliffhanger to keep you interested so that you'll be really excited to see the next video as well. See you then.